How's it going, everybody? Good. We're going to get started with our second Christian atheist dialogue, Black Atheists in the Pulpit. First, greet you really the only way I know how, which is in the spirit of love and in the spirit of Jesus Christ, who is the purpose of this institution. You know, our faith in Christ teaches us that Christ definitely loves us all, and everyone is very much welcome here to speak, you know, in freedom and to exchange ideas. And at the end of the day, we're still brothers and sisters of the human race, and we have probably a lot more in common than not in common. Sikivu Hutchinson first, who is actually one of the foremost black skeptics. Her most recent book, Moral Combat: Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Values Wars. And then we're also very fortunate to have with us Donald Wright, who is a scholar out of Houston, Texas, who actually grew up in the church, very strong Protestant tradition, and then decided not to be a part of the church anymore, authored a book called The Only Prayer I'll Ever Pray: Let My People Go.
Thank you, and I really am looking forward to the dialogue this evening and revisiting what we did last spring. It was very generative, and I just want to begin with a little framing in terms of the trajectory of African American humanism. It's a very robust tradition that not a lot of us know about, and this is Black History Month, and Pastor Seth asked me to come to really orient the congregation and the community vis-a-vis what those traditions are. So just to begin, a little bit about my background. I came from a secular household, which meant that there were no Bibles, there were no Qurans, there were no blue-eyed Jesuses on the wall, there was no amen before breakfast, there were no prayers before going to bed. But what there was a tradition in the home of secular morality based on free thought and social justice. So what that meant was there was a reverence and respect for the golden rule. There was an appreciation of values of empathy. There was an emphasis on giving back to one's community, having a social and moral obligation to one's community. There was an emphasis on looking at the universe vis-a-vis science and reason. And more importantly, there was an emphasis on rejecting hierarchies based on sexual orientation, race, gender, and infidel status. Hierarchies that really inform a lot of the traditions of organized religion globally. And so some of you may be familiar with Steve Harvey's rant against atheists back in 2009. He was making the rounds on the talk show circuit, and he unleashed this barrage of assaults on atheists, basically claiming that atheists don't have any morals because they don't believe in God. And this elicited a backlash in the atheist community, because people who were familiar with Steve Harvey's eminent career as a radio host and a host of that great philosophical tradition, Family Feud, and as a reputed serial philanderer, were in high dudgeon that Steve Harvey could sit in moral judgment on atheists and make these bigoted, totalizing assessments of a whole category of people that were really akin to bigoted, totalizing assessments that have been made about African Americans and other disenfranchised groups. And so if Steve Harvey is, in fact, on the side of God, like Newt Gingrich, like Rick Santorum, like Rick Perry, like Michelle Bachmann, like the GOP, and like the Catholic Church and hucksters like Eddie Long, then many of us heathens are perfectly happy to be headed to hell. So there have always been African American free thinkers and non-believers lurking in our communities, contrary to popular belief. hiding in plain sight here in our churches, in the pulpits, and in the pews, writing some of the greatest American literature in our history, a la Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin and Richard Wright and Langston Hughes and Nella Larson, or spearheading civil rights activism like A. Philip Randolph and Hubert Henry Harrison and James Forman. And so all of these thinkers, leaders, and activists were really intellectual descendants of one of the greatest free thinkers in American history, in global history, really, Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
And so in the 1870s, after emancipation, Frederick Douglass had the unmitigated gall not to thank God for emancipation. And this elicited outrage in the black faith community. And Douglass was a fierce critic of the intractable hypocrisy of a Christian nation that really based its imperial ascent, its imperial power, on the systematic dispossession and brutalization and indoctrination and rape of African slaves, and the articulation of humanity as being antithetical to African slaves. So Frederick Douglass was like, why should I thank a Christian God that has been created in the image of the slaver and the rapist, being one of the preeminent African-American abolitionists? Why should I thank this Christian God
That's right.
for liberation struggle? And to reward him for his apostasy, a group of black ministers banded together, having nothing better to do, and actually issued an official censure of Frederick Douglass, a rebuke of his unholy heathen act. And so in response, Douglass had this to say: I dwell here in no happy cant for thanking God for this deliverance. I bow to no priest, either of faith or unfaith. I claim as against all people perfect freedom of thought. And so pursuant to this, he also said that revivals of religion and revivals of the slave trade go hand in hand. And he paved the way, his radical example paved the way for contemporary African-American free thought, civil and human rights resistance against the Christian fascist tide that we're seeing in this country today, the unrelenting assault against abortion rights, against women's rights, against family planning, against undocumented immigrant rights, against LGBT equality and same-sex marriage, and really the very edifice of social welfare. Unrelenting siege by an unholy alliance between the white Tea Party nationalists and the religious right. And so, by the same token, many African-American contemporary activists and thinkers who are coming from a humanist atheist positionality have begun to push back against what they perceive to be the black church's retreat from a social gospel orientation and moving into a more prosperity gospel orientation, particularly in light of the fact that our communities are the most religious in the United States. 87% of African Americans profess some brand of religious orientation. Yet we see our communities besieged by skyrocketing HIV/AIDS contraction rates, skyrocketing intimate partner violence rates, skyrocketing sexual assault rates, and all of these dynamics have a lot to do with the inveterate heterosexism and homophobia in our communities that dehumanizes lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender families and individuals, as well as African American women. So, what has it historically meant to be a free thinker of color in politically turbulent times? And I want to put this in a little bit of perspective and context in terms of, again, the radical traditions in African American intellectualism. In 1927, A. Philip Randolph, who, as many of you are aware, was a socialist, a labor organizer, an intellectual par excellence, an eminent publisher of a major journal called The Messenger. Randolph sponsors this essay writing contest called Is Christianity a Menace to the Negro? Again, is Christianity a menace to the Negro? And this was a period in which it was, quote unquote, better to be dead than red, and there were commies lurking behind every bedpost. And political radicals were associated with godlessness and vice versa. And so Randolph was constantly being investigated for his politically seditious activities. Also during this period in 1928, the Harlem Renaissance author Nella Larson writes her landmark book, Quicksand. And Quicksand was perhaps one of the first explicitly black feminist critiques of the gender tyrannies of organized religion and the black church. And so the protagonist of Quicksand was a young woman named Helga Crane, who was biracial, caught betwixt and between Harlem, the 1920s, a font of literary and cultural activity, and Copenhagen, Denmark, which was the country of her mother's origin. And she was something of an oddball nonconformist, bucking the authenticity police because she did not view to organize religion. She did not want to be domesticated and merely become a good wife and mother, a sacrificial woman. And so in one passage in the book, she decries what she perceived to be the absurdity of black slavish devotion to the, quote, white man's God. And so she reflects that black devoutness was odd given the depth of black poverty. Religious devotion was dysfunctional for black people because it, quote, blunted the perceptions. It robbed life of its crudest truths. Religion especially had its uses for the poor, for the blacks, how the white man's God must laugh at the great joke he played on them, bound them to slavery, then to poverty and insult, and made them bear it. And so, in the book, I say Helga's rejection of the Christian entreaty to take the possibility of redemption on faith, despite unrelenting earthly evil, misery, and suffering, becomes a catalyst for her retreat from religious dogma. After the book's publication, Larson's probing exploration of the ministry was uneasily received by some. As a woman who, quote, did not believe in religion herself and was considered unconventional for the period, Larson defied the bourgeois prescriptions of black middle-class womanhood, challenging religious faith but conventional norms epitomized by the sacrificial good woman. A recurring theme in both Larson's Quicksand and her 1928 novel Passing is the gulf between society's narrow expectations and her female protagonist's sense of self and subjectivity. In this regard, Quicksand is a stunningly contemporary indictment of black parochialism and moral repression. And so Helga Crane is going through some of the same struggles and challenges that, ironically enough, the young Randolph was confronted by in his early career as an organizer and an intellectual. But Randolph was essentially compelled, in many regards, to retreat from his more radical posture on the insidiousness of organized religion because of the realities of the era. The realities of this era, the 1920s, were that the black church played a towering role in every aspect of civic and political engagement in black life, and that African Americans, of course, were systematically excluded from white-dominated social and political and economic institutions. And so after years of battling white supremacist discrimination in the labor movement, Randolph and his colleagues go on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is one of the most influential black unions in American history, which was based in the railroad industry, and which agitated for the rights of African American male porters and black female maids, because those were, as many of you know, the only occupations that they were able to be employed within in this hyper-segregated industry. And so the BSCP, as an organizer, works very strenuously to collaborate with black churches, but has to overcome the suspicions of the African American community about the intentions of the American labor movement and trade unionism because of white supremacy within the movement, as espoused and articulated particularly by the American Federation of Labor before it joins with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And so many of the more conservative black church congregations were aligned with the Pullman Company's official union. And the Pullman Company's union worked very strenuously to smear and discredit the BSCP as this font of godless communism. And that is something that Randolph edges away from in his efforts to coalition build within the African American community. Randolph was part of this vanguard, again, of African American thinkers, leaders, and activists who actively espoused secular humanist principles of social justice. And for African American non-believers and free thinkers, that has always meant a deep critique of the connections between and amongst capitalism, white supremacy, economic injustice, racial hierarchies of Jim Crow. That has not been the European American tradition per se. And so thinkers who articulated this positionality include W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a preeminent skeptic, rationalist, some might say agnostic in various points of his intellectual career. He was a co-founder of the NAACP. He was an early supporter of the secular Soviet Union and a staunch critic of American imperialist incursions in the Third World. James Forman, who I mentioned earlier, was the one-time head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was an avowed atheist, wrote an essay called God is Dead, and really pushed back against the emergent tradition of the prosperity gospel within mainstream black congregations. The prosperity gospel that was embodied by, of course, iconic figures like Father Divine and Reverend Ike. The writers Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston all explored themes of free thought and humanism in their nonfiction and fiction. And James Baldwin, in his essay, The Fire Next Time, even went so far as to exhort African Americans to get out of the pews, stop praying, and go into the streets and organize. And so fast forward into the 21st century, and there aren't any prominent African Americans who are willing to fly the flag of secularism, much less atheism. And this is part and parcel of the atmosphere that the far-right reactionary attack dogs in the Fox regime have carefully cultivated, specifically Newt, are there no prisons, are there no workhouses, Gingrich, who of course has suggested that it is the destiny of poor children to relinquish their claim to an equitable education and clean the toilets of their more affluent peers because, of course, poor children growing up in economically depressed communities don't see anyone who has a work ethic that they can subscribe to. He's also obviously demonized Barack Obama as the food stamp president, flying in the face of the reality that the majority ethnic and racial group in the United States that receives food stamps are indeed Caucasians. And he's also smeared President Obama as being the font of a secular socialist machine, which is egregious on the face of it, because Obama has very clearly identified as a good Christian. He evokes scripture in his public addresses. He's even cozied up to evangelical homophobes like Rick Warren. He's, of course, greenlit many of the more egregious aspects of Bush's faith-based initiative regime. And at the end of the day, this notion of the Obama administration as being this font of secular socialism is really a demonization of Obama's quote-unquote racial otherness, because it doesn't really matter how good of a Christian Obama portrays himself as. He'll never be a good Christian enough for the white heartland, and he'll never be an American or citizen enough for the birthers, and certainly never be white enough to pass, even in the wildest dreams of the conservative post-racial confabulist because of the one-drop rule. So all of these issues have been really paramount for African American free thinkers who are coming into their own, coming into some visibility as activists within this extremely hostile and extremely evangelical and fundamentalist landscape. And I wanted to hand it over to Donald Wright, who has traveled here from Houston, who is a humanist activist, who has founded the first African American Day of Solidarity for non-believers, and of course has written this really insightful book looking at his trajectory from being a Baptist deacon to a dyed-in-the-wool atheist. So welcome, Donald.
Thank you, Sikivu.